Hello, guys. Professor O'Brien here, with a quick lecture on rhetorical grammar, chapter 7, The Writer's Voice. I know some of you are working with the 6th edition. I'll put some information up about that on Blackboard. And thank you, Sev Ivaliotis, for helping me with that last week. Now, I'm on page 117 of Rhetorical Grammar, 7th edition. And let's quickly look through the chapter preview to go over what we're going to be looking at in this chapter. Number 1, you're going to learn about tone and how to adjust it for different audiences and purposes. And if you're not thinking about your audience already, that's something that you should be doing. Number 2, intimately connected, you're going to be learning to choose words that are appropriate for your rhetorical situation. So for instance, like I keep telling students, please don't swear in the classroom. It's an inappropriate situation. Do it all you want in the student center or with your friends, but to swear in front of your class or the professor suggests that you don't know what words to use in what situation. Be aware. In the same way, in writing, know what words to choose. The third term here, meta-discourse. Meta-discourse typically involves using words, terms, phrases, idioms that make the text self-aware. Now, a text would be self-aware if it says, later on I will explain blah, 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 or as pointed out in the previous chapter, etc. The text is referring to itself. You get the idea. Meta-discourse. And finally, point of view. When you're writing, should you use the third person? Should you be omnipotent? Should you speak in the first person? We'll talk about that. Now, I'm just going to turn to the end of the chapter on page 137 to go over the reminders, which derive from this. What have I done in my sentence structure? Page 137, by the way. What have I done in my sentence structure and word choice to establish my tone? And by tone, I mean my attitude, or my narrator's attitude, my writer's attitude towards the reader and the text. Now, how have I avoided words and phrases, etc., that contradict that tone? If I want to sound like a learned scholar, what do I use? What do I avoid? Number 2, can I hear my personal voice in the words I've written? Now, this is not a bad thing. I know some professors, myself included, say avoid using I and me and my, etc. Too much self-reference makes you seem solipsistic. You're talking about yourself all the time. But what this is talking about really is, have I created a voice that I'm comfortable with? What words would I use, or what words would my persona use in this passage, and what would that persona avoid using? 3, although it isn't really mentioned in this chapter, have I been accurate in attributing ideas to the right people and the right sources? Contractions is spoken about here, and contractions can be a minefield. When should I say is not? When should I say isn't? We'll be talking about that a little more in a few minutes. Now, hedges, the 5th point here. Have I used hedging words appropriately? Now, hedging words are simply a way of guarding yourself against criticism. So, for instance, somebody might claim the coronavirus, or let's say SARS. SARS sweeps through every country it hits. Now, that may be true, but that seems like a very sweeping generalism. And if you look at maps, you'll find some countries haven't been hit so much by this viral outbreak as others. Let's hedge. We can use something like usually, often, potentially. So the SARS virus usually sweeps through every country it affects. Now, that allows the chance for exceptions. There might be countries unaffected or countries where a few cases have been found, but that's it. You get my point. Use hedges so as not to be accused of being overgeneralistic, because you'll often be wrong. Learn that you can be wrong. It's one of the most liberating discoveries you can make, to be able to stand in front of a large group of people and say, I may be wrong. Okay. Do note the punctuation reminders at the bottom of the page there. Have I set off meta discourse markers with commas particularly? Okay, let's get into the guts of this chapter now. Tone. Like I said, tone involves the writer's attitudes towards the reader and the text. There are 3 quotes provided at the bottom of page 117 there that you might find in any typical text. The point being here, you can probably tell how the reader feels from reading those sentences. You might not be certain how the writer feels, but you can certainly tell that there's a personality back there. Now, the top of page 118 draws from this. What personality are you creating in your writing? It need not be you, by the way. A great writer, every great writer, creates a personality that's not necessarily them to tell their story. And it need not be fiction either. It might be non-fiction. Look at the 2 bold words at the top of the page there. How does your writer's voice sound? What determines its tone? Now, this involves you becoming a little bit self-aware and your text becoming self-aware. It's the rhetorical situation. What are you writing about? What's the purpose of your writing? Who is your audience? All of this is going to change the way your attitude comes across in the text, or at least it should. Now, journalists will typically be matter of fact, but take a look at the article about the giant rodent, 2/3 of the way down page 118. You'll agree, I hope, with the text that it's tongue-in-cheek. Take a look at the choice of words and the types of phrases used in the article on Social Security at the top of page 119. The federal government had to cough up cash last month and mail a letter of explanation, etc. Shortchanged. It seems. Faulty math. Recipients won't get rich. There's a voice in there. Now, I'm not saying that everything you write should be like this. That Social Security article was written for Parade magazine, which is what Europeans would call a feuilleton. It's this sort of light extra sheet that gets added to the newspaper on Sundays. It's got general interest stuff. It's usually much lighter than the op-ed page or the front page. So it's the right tone for the feuilleton, for Parade magazine. I very strongly recommend that you attempt exercise 20. I think it's clever, and my students in the past have learned a great deal about style by rewriting those passages, the 2 passages provided in that exercise. Now, staying on tone, but going one level in, I move on to page 120, diction. Now, diction is simply another way of saying the words and phrases you use to establish tone, that is to say, to establish your attitude. Now, you may have heard the term denotation and connotation in the past, or vice versa. All this means is that a word can mean something, but imply something else. So the word provided as the example is excellent there. there's a big difference between saying, my father is economical and my father is cheap. They both mean the same thing, thrifty, but the second one has negative connotations. This is why I counsel you not to simply look up words in thesauruses or right-click thesaurus in Microsoft Word, because you'll frequently choose words that have more or less the correct denotation, but an absolutely incorrect connotation. I had a paper from a student several years ago which claimed that William Butler Yeats was a notorious poet. Now, he may have been, but if he was, his notoriety was a great secret. Now, I think the notorious B.I.G. is responsible for the rise of notorious to simply mean famous. But notorious actually means famous for crime. So you might say, for instance, Osama bin Laden was a notorious terrorist. But you would never say that Mahatma Gandhi was a notorious politician. Well, there are certain Indians who might say that. Notorious means famous for all the wrong reasons. Now, in the same way, there are many words you can choose which may seem to have the right denotation, but are sending the wrong message in the connotations. The denotation of the word bitch simply means female dog, but would you use that word anywhere these days? It has developed very negative connotations. Be careful about the words you choose. This is the central message of the diction part of this chapter. What words are you using to get across what tone? Now, aside from going too informal, you can go too formal. I love the example at the bottom of page 121 of the potential law student's application for law school. She writes, "It has long been a tenet of my value system that as a capable individual, I have a social and moral duty to contribute to the improvement of the society in which I live." What a load of hogwash. The student, in an attempt to sound grand, has simply ended up sounding opaque. It's not entirely clear what the student is trying to mean at all. Why not simply say something like, "I've always wanted to be a law student. I've always wanted to help people through the legal process." Sounds more personal, gives personality to the person who's saying it, and it certainly is a lot clearer than the passage we just read there. Yes, like it says, the text, like many inexperienced writers, this person associates formal writing with lofty phrases and uncommon words. You can be formal without using grand words and opaque phrases. Now, that's not to say that you should keep everything at a 6th grade reading level. As the text points out, it's okay to use words like preclude if they're the most precise word for the job, as is exactly the case in the opening sentence of the top paragraph on page 122. Might be a rare enough word in everyday language, but it's perfect for that situation. Are you the sort of person who utilizes utilize instead of using use? Don't utilize. That word is an attempt to sound grand when you can just say use. And there are hundreds of other examples like that. Keep it simple unless you've a good reason to use a longer or grander sounding synonym. I think the exercise on page 122, at the bottom there, the group discussion, is excellent. See, can you order those words Can you arrange those words in order of formality? There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 examples there. Try it. Question 3 I find very revealing as well. It points out, number 1, how frequently we use similes. How often are you going to say quiet as a mouse? Strong as an ox. Can you think of an alternative? So for instance, how about, as the text suggests, quiet as a cloudy sky? That is a nice simile. See, can you come up, well, see, first of all, can you finish all the similes, all of the common phrases there? And then see, can you replace them with something startling? And by startling, I mean good, not bad. You can always startle for the wrong reasons as well, and we don't want you to do that. Now, one of a great rhetorical tool is metaphor. The text kind of folds simile in here too, honestly. Every metaphor and simile is an image. All the world's a stage. Happiness is a warm puppy. General Motors is an industrial dinosaur. Excellent examples. These images immediately get the message across in a way that abstract language might not be able to. So think about how you might be able to use metaphor well and carefully. Read through the group discussion exercise there on page 125. I don't think is an absolutely fantastic example of metaphor, except the opening sentence there, which is of course explained. The whole rest of the paragraph is an explanation of the metaphor. That Glacier is an archivist and historian. I like it. Okay, verbs and formality. This is a major point. Page 125. Many of us, I commit this sin too, are lazy. We use compound verbs rather than waiting the extra quarter second for our minds to come up with a more accurate one-word alternative. Rather than give something up, for instance, why not use the word surrender? Instead of turning something down, why not reject something? You get the idea. These compound words are usually a common word plus a preposition. So turn down, bring about, bring on, stand for. They're all common verbs with which get a new meaning when a preposition is added to them. Well, it's actually a particle in this case, but its use is almost exactly the same as that of a preposition. The text says idioms are certainly appropriate in informal contexts. That is to say, we're going to use all these in everyday conversation. He turned down the offer, for example, rather than he rejected the offer. But I think you can raise the tone of your text by seeking out one-word alternative to these verbs, which I consider lazy and I see too often in student writing. And I'll be increasingly marking these in your writing when I see them as lazy writing. So look out in your own writing for this kind of thing. In this regard, do exercise 21, A and B. It's an excellent test of your ability to find, to raise the quality of your diction. Right. Nominalized verbs. Now, those of you who are business majors or who do business will know that this is a major feature of, business writing. nominalize actions. So turn the verb to occur into an occurrence, turn the verb succeed into success, and then put the resulting nominalized verb along with the verb to be or to have. So he succeeds can be changed to he has success. Now, I feel the first option is superior. However, there is a good reason to use nominalization, as the text suggests here on page 126, and that is when you're trying to stick to the given new contract. Now, look at the example 2/3 of the way down page 126. The first sentence has the verb differs. Now, we want to keep that as known information in the second sentence, so we nominalize it. So we have to differ in the first sentence and difference in the second sentence. And listen to how neatly the given new contract functions in that second sentence. The grammar of the written language differs greatly from that of the spoken language. This difference is attributable to the constant innovations of spoken language. That's a nice segue. Okay. Now, on top of all this, nominalization can often confuse readers because very often the agent vanishes. If you say success, who's succeeding? If you say combination, who's combining? Now, look at the sentence at the top of page 127, the one that's set off. High student achievement led to the creation of the gifted student programs. Is there an agent? There isn't really. It's as if the creation happened through an act of God. And that's not what happened. Somebody created it. So let's put an agent back in, just as the text does slightly further down. The school board created the Gifted Students Program for High Achievers. Ah, now we have an agent, the school board. In this regard, do exercise 22. It's a great bit of fun, and it reminds you that nominalizations are fine as long as you don't lose sight of the agent. There's a section here on contractions on page 128, which I think I'm just going to float through here. When is it appropriate to say, hasn't the winter weather been wonderful? And when is it appropriate to say, has the winter weather not been wonderful? I think the second sentence sounds odd. The absence of a contraction actually draws more attention to that sentence, and it's attention that you might not necessarily want drawn. So although you might have had high school teachers or middle school teachers who told you never use contractions, in fact, there are situations when you can, maybe even should, but you've got to think about it. When you use a contraction, ask yourself, why am I using this contraction? Okay, the third major section of this chapter has to do with meta-discourse on page 130 here. Meta-discourse is simply textually aware signals that help the reader understand the message and the direction of the passage. Now, typically, meta-discourse involves conjunctive adverbs or adverbial phrases. Things like however, thus, nevertheless, although something something, in other words, in addition, in fact. Now, these are textually self-referential in that however says, well, that was said, but I'm saying this instead. So be aware of adverbials, which can often be sub-clauses that are hedging in some way or other, adding extra information. Yeah, just be aware of it. We spoke about hedges briefly earlier. We'll speak about them again now. And I'm just going to read the sentence aloud that I find halfway down page 131. Although you might think that using words like perhaps and probably would communicate doubt about the author's authority and the reliability of the information, such hedges actually have the opposite effect on the reader. George Dillon maintains that they certify the reader as a modest, careful scholar whose tentative conclusions are probably of wider application and greater likelihood than he feels he can claim. So just like what I was saying about the virus earlier on in this lecture. There are 3 excellent examples at the bottom of the page. As you probably noticed, the only difference between the 2 passages is in the word order in the last sentence. Now, do you also notice how that sentence refers to the reader? It's in a way breaking the 4th wall, isn't it? Because it's addressing the reader as you. The second example. In this chapter, we look at a feature of language you might not have thought about before. Its rhythm, its regular beat. Now, you don't just have a you there. Hopefully you saw the you. You also have a self-reference to the chapter. In this chapter, we look, etc. By the way, notice the first person we there as well. And then finally, third example there. In chapter 5, you learned that known information often occurs in the subject position. This is again self-referential. The text is referring to a previous chapter. And there's that you again. Okay, I'm sorry about all that noise in the background. I opened the window because it's a nice warm day. And every evil doer in the state appears to be out on a loud motorcycle at the moment. This, despite the governor's appeal for people to stay close to home. New Jersey, you're next. I feel the passage on page 132, the exercise, the group discussion one on Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions is excellent. There's a great deal of meta-discourse in that text, and it's worth looking at. All right, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on the final portion of this chapter, point of view. All we're really interested in is how aware you might be of where your narrator or speaker is in a text. Now, there's a long discussion of personal pronouns here in singular and plural, first, second, and third person. Many writers will use we. It's very common, and there are some examples at the top of page 134 there, particularly in a professional environment. And take a look at the example from Stephen Hawking there. Now, at first sight, all this evidence that the universe looks the same whichever direction we look in might seem to suggest that there is something special about our place in the universe. Now, hopefully you understand there's a sort of a mix between the royal we that Stephen Hawking is using there, but also his declaration that the reader and he are in the same group. We're on the surface of the planet looking out into the universe. Now, you've probably been told by your professors before, stay away from you. Now, I'm going to tell you the same thing. You may use you, but you've got to be careful. So there are 2 examples at the top of page 135 here. I think the second sounds better. The first, when one sees the Golden Gate Bridge for the first time, the sight is simply breathtaking. I prefer the immediacy of the alternative. When you see the Golden Gate Bridge for the first time, the sight is simply breathtaking. So there may indeed be opportunities to use you. Same with I. Be careful. Do not pepper your paper with I, because it tires the reader out and makes you think that you are only interested in yourself. And you do not want your readers thinking that. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. I'm not enthused by the two assignments at the end of the chapter there. So I'm just going to sign off. We spoke about the rhetorical reminders, which are basically just a précis of what we've done in this chapter. And I'll sign off. So there we are. Hope you enjoyed.